Is Trump on the brink of helping to bring an end to the war in Ukraine? It is certainly something that we're rooting for, and we will talk to our friend Bill Roggio about it now. He's a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. You know him from Long War Journal. He gets deep into this stuff, deep into the weeds of conflicts abroad. Bill, let's start with this. Can you just give me, and we got a few minutes here to do this, what is the status of the conflict right now? It's still ongoing, right? No ceasefire, so you still have both sides shooting at each other. Where do we find ourselves as we look over the battlefield in Ukraine? What is the status quo?
Yeah, hello, Buck. And the status is that the war continues. The Russians are eating the Ukrainian cow one small bite at a time. The Russians are making small gains daily, but these gains add up. In the Donbass region, which is made up primarily of the Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts in eastern Ukraine, the Russians control nearly all of Luhansk and about 60 to 70% of the Donbass. Remaining are two large cities of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, and then there's several smaller cities. The Russians are surrounding one city that used to be the key logistical hub for Ukrainian forces. The city's called Poprovsk. And the Russians recently made a small breakthrough north of that city that could have put the Russian troops into the rear of the cities of Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. The Ukrainians were able to blunt that offensive, but it's come at a cost. And that cost is that they stripped elite units from their positions along the front to stop the Russians. And that fighting's still ongoing. That outcome has still not been decided, but apparently now the Russians, at least their advance has been halted. And now the Russians are advancing in other areas, cities like Seversk and Kostina, Tanika. These cities are, the Russians are preparing to surround both of those cities at this time. A lot of this is both, Buck, this is a war of both attrition and territory. So the Russians are certainly winning the war of attrition. Ukrainians were able to make that small breakthrough because some of these positions along the front line, the trenches and fortifications, a lot of them were unmanned. The Ukrainians thought they could fill those holes with drones, and Russians have come up with creative ways to get around that. And that's it. But it's, as far as the war of territory, as I said at the opening, the Russians are taking small bits and pieces of.
Can I ask you about
Ukrainian
the attrition part of this? Because I'm curious. I've heard, and this was even when I was at the White House speaking to some of Trump's national security officials back in June, the numbers for the losses here, and I know casualties, right? People usually including fatalities and wounded in that, but the numbers that they're telling me are in the hundreds of thousands at this point of soldiers, right? That's what the casualty figures are looking like. Does Russian manpower is Russian manpower being depleted at a level where it is uncertain they could continue this level of offensive against the Ukrainian defensive positions, or are there just so many Russians and so much conscription that they could keep doing this for years?
Yeah, the Russians have a population 4 times of that of Ukraine. They've shown a willingness to sacrifice forces. Now, I dispute those numbers that we're seeing. Most of these numbers come from the Ukrainians themselves, which have been inflating casualties since the beginning of the war. We're seeing something like 20,000 Russians killed monthly is some of the reporting. I'm highly skeptical.
Let's dig into this.
That
What
might
do
be
you think?
casual.
You've looked at, and I know you were a Long War Journal. You've been a GWAT guy. You served the military yourself. So you understand the casualty figures, the situation of how this stuff gets tabulated. What do you think the casualty numbers really are? I mean, if somebody said to you, I really need to know. If Trump sat down and he said, look, how many Russians do you think have been killed in this conflict in 3 years? I'm talking soldiers now, not civilians. And how many, well, that would not really affect Russian civilians, and how many Ukrainian soldiers have been killed in 3 years? What do you think is a realistic number?
I mean, that's really difficult. There's been so much misinformation and disinformation put out, largely on the Russian side of the casualties, largely by the Ukrainians. And have those numbers. Maybe a quarter. So perhaps 100,000 Russian dead over
Because this is
3
what
years.
this is what I'm trying to get at. If the Russians have lost 300,000 or 400,000 people, I mean, truly, like either killed or combat ineffective forever, wounded severely. They even the Russians can't keep that up for years ahead, right? I mean, if they had lost 500,000 people already in the fighting, which is one of the numbers I've heard, they're going to run out of people pretty soon. It sounds to me like you're saying no, they've lost a much lesser number than that, and so this can continue much longer.
Look, even if they were taking that number of casualties, I just look at what the amount of casualties the Russians took in World War II. I mean, 6 million Russians are estimated to have been killed. How many millions were captured by the Germans during the war as well? It's their way of warfare. It has been. It always has been their way of warfare. So, could we take those level of casualties? Absolutely not, Buck. Can the Ukrainians take those level of casualties? I think they have been, and so have the Russians. But again, I think even so. Look, I would say even if that number,
this is important too, because you're telling me, Bill, that Putin knows that this is in the most grim, macabre fashion. It's a numbers game, and it's a numbers game that he's inevitably going to win if he stays on this.
It's exactly correct, Buck. Yeah, this is a game he has calculated. The Russians are recruiting far more people now, but it's working, and they're going to the front. It's a different culture. It's a different way of life. Sacrifice and hardship for the Russians.
Let's get around then to the other side, because so the Russian will to continue the fight, and that's critical, and you've put out there why. I have to give a moment to our sponsor here, but I want to come back and ask you, Bill, how could Ukraine, what would be required? Not what will happen, right? But just theoretically, take me through an order of battle of what would be necessary for Ukraine to really turn the tide, right, in a meaningful way. What would be some of those things? Let's get to that in 1 second. Preborn is in a league of its own. This is a nonprofit that saved the lives of tens of thousands of babies last year and will save the lives of tens of thousands of babies this year. The team of people working at Preborn provide pregnant moms with offers of support and assistance. They've also found that offering the gift of an ultrasound can make all the difference. An ultrasound from Preborn is just $28. That's per ultrasound. So if you can donate $28 or $280, that would be 10 ultrasounds. You can be saving the lives of tiny babies today, because Preborn is on the front lines of life. To donate securely, dial pound 250 and say the keyword baby. That's pound 250, say baby, or go to preborn.com/buck, preborn.com/BUCK. All right, now take me through, because I think this is important. We'll get into the diplomacy and negotiations here in a few minutes, Bill. But what would actually have to happen for Ukraine to be able to hold the line and inflict Russian casualties at such a rate that Russia wouldn't be in a position to keep chipping away and eating more of Ukraine's territory?
I don't think that's possible. I think the time has passed. The best chance the Ukrainians had when they were given the weapons and material in the 2023 offensive, which we all watched, was a complete failure. That was the high point, in my estimation, of the Ukrainian military. The Russians would have to make such monumental mistakes for the Ukrainians to be able to. Now, Buck, are you talking about what can drive the Russians out of or get the Ukrainians on the offensive?
I mean what could force a true stalemate, so that, because I think people have, right, so that Putin thinks, okay, I've gotten as much as I can get, under the current realities. Is that achievable? No. Kicking all the Russians out, I don't think that's achievable at all. I mean, because right now you still have the Russians thinking, or Putin's thinking, we're going to keep, you said, taking bites of the cookie or the apple or whatever. We're going to keep taking little pieces of territory. Is it possible that the Ukrainians, with better air cover, better air defense, just more personnel, they'd be able to say, we actually, because they're building these really elaborate trench networks now, right? 6-layer trench networks. They get the barbed wire, they get minefields, they get anti-tank, they get anti-personnel. I mean, it's going all the way back. Do you think that they'll be able to hold them, or are the Russians just going to keep coming? Because I think that's a critical calculation that affects the diplomatic side of this.
Well, they would need to be able to man those fortifications, which they won't. The Ukrainians refuse to lower the draft age below 25 because of a demographic issue. They recognize that if they start going after that population, that they're going to have serious demographic issues after the war ends. But the other side of that argument is there may not be a Ukraine left, or a viable Ukraine left, if they don't begin the draft. So that's how the Russians are able to penetrate and take land because the Ukrainians can't man all these fortifications that they built. They would need such a massive influx of artillery systems and long and short range drones and other air force. They would need a massive air force. They'd need to be able to suppress the Russian Air Force, not just at the line of contact, but far beyond it. So that would require a massive number of air defense units that would have to be deployed forward. Again, the time to receive that equipment, that's past. I don't think the United States is going to supply it. I don't think we're talking hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars.
Well, you're somewhat bleak, if I can characterize it that way. You're somewhat bleak analysis of the Ukrainian military's prospects, Bill. I think is reflected very much in the Russian and Putin's attitude about all this. Which
and also
problem,
I think
right?
it reflects President Trump's desire to get a peace deal, because I do think the administration does understand that things aren't going as well for the Ukrainians as is being told. Look, I think the Ukrainians need a ceasefire. They need to be able to get those troops. Troops are not being rotated off the line for months and months at a time. Some guys have been serving on the front lines in and out for since the beginning of this conflict, even before this conflict began. It's just not sustainable. Putin certainly believes that he could grind down the Ukrainians. That's what I'm watching him do. Now, it's not simple. It's not something that the Russians can do today, tomorrow, or even next month. But I look at this in the term of what does it look like 6 months or 1 year or 2 years from now? If the Russians are committed to maintaining this level of fighting, which I believe they can do, this does not bode well for Ukraine. They could, the question is Ukraine going to have to make some type of land concession, or are they just going to let the Russians take it over time? I don't like any of this, Buck, to be clear. I'm not sitting here saying that the Ukrainians should cede territory that the Russians haven't taken. The Ukrainians need to be looking for creative ways to get a ceasefire so they could reorganize.
You're looking at the data and the maps and everything every day, and I think so many people, including, speaking just from a sort of generalist media perspective, we come in and come out on this issue, and even though I've been very skeptical for years, I said when the first invasion happened, people are underestimating the Russian from the very beginning. They're underestimating the Russian war machine. They're underestimating the casualties, which we were just talking about, that Russia's willing to take, whether it's 50,000 or 500,000. I mean, they're underestimating the Russians' willingness to stay in this fight, even if casualties get to really grotesque levels, and that it's going to cost America the better part of $1 trillion before this thing is done. If we're really the financial backers of all this, okay, we're at $300 billion now. Not quite. We're going to be at a half a trillion for sure, and that's even if I think things start to slow down a bit. But I'm just, it's interesting to me, Bill, because there seems to be such surprise. Why is it so hard to get a deal done? And most people seem to think, oh, it's because of the negotiation over the land. Zelensky wants this, Putin wants that. This is what's fair. If Putin thinks he's going to get even more by continuing the fight, he wants to continue the fight. That's the real problem.
Yeah, it is. And he wants more than just land, too, to be clear, Buck. He wants, a change in government. He wants to ensure that there isn't NATO forces or Western forces based in Ukraine. He wants basically Ukraine to be a vassal state, to be a country like Belarus that could be controlled. And the Ukrainians aren't willing to do that, nor should they be willing to do that. It's a conundrum. It's a catch-22 for the Ukrainians. How do they get this ceasefire? How do they get this deal without conceding? At the very least, the Russians are never going to hand over any of the land that they've grabbed so far. And it's been significant. Over 20% of Ukrainian territory has been taken by the Russians. So that's not going to happen, but there has to be ways. This is where I'm looking at these talks, and I think it's a positive thing. I think Trump's doing the right thing and making an effort.
Well, can we pause on where the talks go for 1 second?
Sure.
I want to dive into that with our next segment, if you will, here. But first up, our sponsor is Endpoint Lock. There's a risk you take every time you go online, every time you log into your bank account, all that stuff. Surveillance software called a keylogger. They can secretly record keystrokes typed on a computer or a mobile device just like yours, and that happens before any encryption kicks in. That's why you need Endpoint Lock, the ultimate keystroke encryption tool that stops keyloggers dead in their tracks. With military-grade 256-bit encryption, Endpoint Lock protects your passwords, emails, and sensitive data right at the source, your keyboard. Work silently in the background, no pop-ups, no hassle, just powerful protection across all your devices. It's impossible to steal what can't be seen. Visit endpointlockconsumer.com today. That's endpointlockconsumer.com. Endpoint Lock, where privacy begins. All right, now, Bill, let's talk the process here with a focus on what you think Trump can realistically achieve and how.
I think it's possible to get a ceasefire. That is not a peace agreement that will settle this war, but I do think it could be possible to get a ceasefire. The thing that these talks will help do, I think the Trump administration is still figuring out what Putin wants and what Putin doesn't want. And that is the one reason why these talks are positive. But Putin doesn't want a ceasefire. He wants, basically, when he says he wants a peace deal, what he really wants is a surrender. This is why he's saying he won't meet Zelensky until the peace deal is on the table, which would be basically come and sign your agreement to surrender, because he believes he has all the cards. Look, there are some cards that the West plays with sanctions, additional sanctions. I mean, it'd be really nice if the Europeans stopped buying, over
Well, this is what I was talking
$20
about on radio the other day. I said people who are saying, oh, the sanctions. Europeans are still buying. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a fraction of what it was, but on the oil side, but on the natural gas side, they're still buying a ton of Russian natural gas. It's cold in Dusseldorf in the wintertime.
Yeah. I mean, that's if the West is serious. I mean, I saw that. I wasn't able to confirm this, but it sounds right that the Europeans buy more in Russian petroleum products than they do donating to Ukraine yearly. That's they're funding a war. They're funding Russia's war. This is no way to fight a war. This is no way to be a real, true ally. So these things need to be resolved. If they can be resolved, maybe additional pressure could be placed on Putin.
The other thing is these countries, as I understand it, the countries that we're told are stepping in, China and Iran and India, and that are buying, Russian oil because they don't care. Some of them are selling it back to the Europeans.
Yeah.
So they're really just in a middleman position. The whole thing is so screwed up. We're led to believe, Russia is this isolated power. Does Russia look like the ruble has plunged, 80%, and that the people can't get food in the streets? No. In fact, if anything, their industrial capacity seems to be, from what you can see on the front lines, right? The industrial capacity seems to be improving, and they're putting out more and better drones to use on those front lines than ever before.
No, that's absolutely correct. They've actually outpaced the Ukrainians in drone production now and employment and the technology for it. They've innovated in these areas. This is one of the longer term concerns of mine. I know it's not something you asked, but the Russians are learning about modern warfare daily on the battlefield. It'll make them a more effective.
Well, I was going to ask you about this. I worry that this is a laboratory for what the warfare of the future is going to be like, and the Russians are getting quite a lesson.
Yeah, and Buck, we learned all the wrong lessons during the war on terror, right? Small wars, rules of engagement, fear of casualties. The Russians are doing the exact opposite.
I mean, the focus was on really the GWAT era, right? There was so much focus on human intelligence collection, CIA and stuff like that, and really elite infantry, Rangers, SEALs, SF, and all this, going after HVTs, high value targets, in Iraq or Afghanistan, and that was for those conflicts. If you're talking about fighting against Russian military, that stuff is all, you can train some private to fly. It doesn't matter how good you are, how strong you are, how good a shot you are. If you got a drone swarm over your head and there are privates on the other side who are able to send these hunter-killer drones after you to blow up right next to you, I mean, that's game over.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that point, I saw this video released by the Marines, and they were working on integrating drones into their units, and they're saying, and we're going to move forward with this in December. And I just stood there with my mouth agape, and I'm like, what are you waiting for? As a matter of fact, why wasn't this done 2 Decembers ago? What war have you guys been watching? And this is a big concern of mine, that we're still fighting the last wars, and we're not even caught up to understanding the nature of these wars. Yep, yeah, I completely agree with you, Buck.
I mean, it's the pace also of the drone advancements that we see is is both fascinating and concerning. But our sponsor is Paradigm Press. The federal government has some funding problems, and Social Security, for example, and $37 trillion in debt. What can you do about this? Well, Trump's doing a lot, and this administration's trying. But what if there was something else? Jim Rickards, a 50-year government insider, has a point of view on what could solve this. He's advised 4 presidential administrations, and he says President Trump is on the verge of a breakthrough. He says America is anything but broke, and that investors who understand why could make a fortune in the months ahead. Jim Rickards believes if you're over 50, this could be your last chance to create lasting wealth, regardless of politics. For the full story and learning how you could profit, go to birthright2025.com. That's birthright2025.com, paid for by Paradigm Press. Let me just ask you, just the last minute or two we have here, Bill. So what do you think happens with these peace negotiations and with this conflict? What's your projection over the next 6 to 12 months?
I don't think we're going to see a ceasefire or a peace agreement anytime soon. I think the Trump administration is going to learn that Putin has, believes that he has the advantage here, that he's the one actually holding the cards. And I think the Trump administration will continue to try to engage. This is something that President Trump likes. He likes to show that he's resolving conflicts. We had the Armenia, Azerbaijan, we had Iran, Pakistan, getting a ceasefire between Israel and Iran. I'm sorry, that was India, Pakistan.
Yeah.
And so I think he's going to continue to make these efforts. But I think in the next 6 months, I think you just could see a continuation of the fighting. And I think you'll see these small gains by the Russians. They'll engulf several of these smaller cities, and they're going to begin to put pressure within the next year and set itself up in a position to take what it wants to achieve via a peace agreement, so-called peace agreement.
Right. Bill Roggio of FDD, Foundation of Defense of Democracies. Always appreciate you, sir. Good to see you.
Great to see you, Buck. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you.